do every single day, ensuring small business owners have access to capital, expanding access to mental health care for young people and students, fighting for common sense gun safety legislation. And as president of the Senate, she's made so many of our victories possible. She broke John Adams' record of casting tie-breaking votes and confirming nominees to the bench and passing historic legislation. So it's my pleasure and my honor to welcome the Vice President of the United States to this call, Kamala Harris.
Thank you, Mayor Steve Benjamin, for your leadership and all that you do on behalf of our administration. Hello, everyone. I want to thank you all for joining us today. You can hear I have a bit of a frog in my throat. Please forgive me. I've been talking about this issue a lot recently. On this call, we have community leaders, labor leaders, state and local elected officials representing all 50 states and the territories. And you all are on this call. So obviously, because you are leaders in your communities, and you stay informed about what is happening. And for that reason, people turn to you when they need to understand and make sense of it all. So today we have come together to address a subject that impacts the life of every American, the debt ceiling, to make sure America does not default on its debt. As you all know, Republicans in Congress have threatened to cause the United States to default on paying its debt. A default would be unprecedented. It has never happened before. It would mean, if it happens, that it would be the first time in history that the United States government would not pay its bills. Now, congressional Republicans claim they are threatening default because they want to lower our nation's debt. Okay, so let's be clear. For Republicans in Congress, this issue is not really about lowering our nation's debt, because if they really cared about lowering our debt, they would not also fight to protect trillions of dollars in Trump tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans and the biggest corporations. Tax cuts that would add $3.5 trillion
We're having a bit of a technical difficulty, so just give us 1 second and we'll get back live in a second. Thank you. Again, Steve Benjamin here. Everyone hold tight. We'll be back in a second. Thank you. And while we clear that up, I'm going to go ahead and introduce the director of the National Economic Council, Dr. Lael Brainard. Lael, why don't you go ahead and present? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And while we wait for the Vice President's sound to be restored, why don't I pick up a little bit on the themes that she was raising, and just talk a little bit about what is at stake. Under the President and the Vice President's leadership, we have seen the strongest economic recovery, I think, in our country's history. And it's lifting up lives all across the country. So if you look at the unemployment rate, it's at its lowest level since 1969. For Black Americans, it is at its lowest level that's ever been recorded. We've seen the strongest 2 years of applications for Americans starting small businesses that we've ever seen. And we're seeing unprecedented investments all around the country in areas like clean energy, infrastructure, innovation, where President Biden and Vice President Harris have been engaged in securing historic legislation. And while we've had high inflation, inflation's actually been coming down. It's come down 10 months in a row. It's down by about 45%. So that's a record we're committed to building on. But right now, when I talk to business owners and labor leaders all around the country, the one thing I hear that the biggest single threat to the continued progress we're seeing is the risk that Congress fails to prevent a default. The risk that Congress fails to pay the bills that they have already agreed to pay and that they've already legislated. As the Vice President was explaining, defaulting on our obligations would likely lead millions of Americans to lose their jobs. It would lead the stock market to fall sharply, which of course would hurt retirement accounts of countless Americans around the country. It would mean car loans would become much more expensive, mortgage loans would become more expensive, and the cost of borrowing for the US government would become much, much more expensive. So the last thing American families need is a manufactured crisis that would destabilize the hard-won progress we've seen for no reason. So the good news is Congress has acted to avert default 78 times over the last several decades. Every single time this issue has come up, Congress has acted. They acted 3 times to lift or suspend the debt ceiling under the last president. So it's not complicated what needs to be done here, and there is plenty of precedent. As the Vice President was explaining, conversations between the administration's team and the team of the Speaker of the House are now ongoing. And our goal is to work towards a reasonable bipartisan budget agreement, which we do every year. It's also really important to just be clear about policies that the President and Vice President do not see as consistent with past precedent for reasonable bipartisan budget agreements. The administration's negotiating team is fighting against extreme attempts to reverse the progress we've made, creating clean energy jobs, combating climate change, and lowering costs for middle-class families, including for students and for insulin and other drugs. And the administration's negotiators are also instructed to resist extreme attempts to take health care away from Americans or otherwise push Americans into poverty. And I think it's just worth noting that the Biden-Harris budget that was released earlier this year would have accomplished a great deal, $3 trillion in deficit reduction, following on the $1.7 trillion in deficit reduction that has already been achieved. But it just takes an approach that is more consistent with the Biden-Harris administration's values, which is to make sure that all Americans are paying a fair share, even as we work to address the deficit. So let me wrap up and hand back to Mayor Benjamin. Thank you very much.
We've got the audio issues being resolved. So, Madam Vice President, are back on with us?
Yes, I'm here. I am here.
Yes, ma'am.
And thank you, Mayor. So to complete my point, I will say where we left off was to talk about the real stakes and issues that are at play. A default could trigger a recession, stop military paychecks, and raise interest rates for years to come, and turn mortgage rates into a situation where they would actually go up. Credit card payments would go up, and small business loans would be more expensive. It would also reduce the amount of money in your retirement accounts. So for an average American close to retirement, their 401k could lose over $20,000 hard-earned dollars. And a default would also put at risk programs that millions of Americans rely on, including Social Security and Medicare. So I think everyone here understands that the reason we have convened you as leaders is because this is really a critical issue. It is not some abstract policy debate. And you only need to look back to 2011 to remember what it can mean right now. Back in 2011, we saw that even coming close to a default, even coming close, can hurt our nation's economy and families. By coming close to a default, back then, prices in the stock market fell almost 20% for more than a year. Millions of people lost money out of their retirement accounts. It became more difficult for both small and large businesses to secure loans, fill orders, and hire new workers because the financial system was no longer confident that our nation could pay its bills. By some estimates, there would be 1 million more jobs today in our nation had that not happened. But be clear, all of that did happen. And that was without an actual default. It happened just because we came close. So all of this is obviously unacceptable, I'm sure, to all of you, and certainly to me and to President Biden. And we believe it is absolutely unnecessary. This does not have to be a crisis. Our position is clear and simple. Congress must act to prevent default. That is what Congress has done more than 70 times. I said 70 times since 1960. And that is what it did 3 times under the previous administration. America must pay our bills, just like you and your family and other hardworking Americans do every single day. And Congress must not create this crisis, which is why President Biden and I met with our 4 congressional leaders Tuesday here at the White House. We had a productive conversation. We believe that it occurred in good faith, with all the leaders in that meeting agreeing that America will not default. During that meeting, the President and the Speaker of the House designated senior members of our teams who will continue to negotiate. They met yesterday, and they will continue to meet. And right now, we just need you, the leaders on this call, to do what you always do and make sure your voices are heard. Make sure members of Congress know a default would not be acceptable under any circumstances. Talk with your friends, your neighbors, your colleagues, and make sure they understand the real consequences a default would have on their lives, immediate consequences. And do what you all on this call in particular do best. Let's organize, activate our communities, and remind folks of what's at stake and get the word out about why this issue is so important and why Congress must act. And I'll close with this. In the United States of America, we pay our bills. People have to pay their bills, and our government has to pay its bills. Our nation has never defaulted on its debt, and it never will, with the support and the leadership of all of you on this call. I thank you. I'm turning it back over to you, Mayor Benjamin, and thank you for your leadership as well. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Madam Vice President. And really thanks to the thousands of you who chose to join this call today to discuss this incredibly important topic. And again, thanks, Madam Vice President, Director Brainard, for providing critical updates as everyone's transfixed on this major issue, making sure that America does not default on its debt for the first time in our over 200-year history. As the Vice President said, these are all leaders on this call. People turn to you when they need information to understand what's happening in our nation. The Fourth Estate is well represented on this call as well. People are turning to you, and we ask that everyone stay engaged in this conversation and tell the story why this issue is so important and why Congress must act and do its job. Our nation has never defaulted on its debt, and it never should. Keep an eye out on your inboxes. We're going to be in touch as the situation continues to evolve, and we thank you so much in advance for continuing to be our partners on this. Godspeed.